Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all back. I am Leah Thatchell. I'm the Director of Visitor Experience and Strategic Outreach here at Planting Fields. It's so lovely having all of you here. And it is my honor and privilege to introduce our next presenter, who is Sara Zewde, Assistant Professor of Practice at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and founding principal of Studio Zewde, a New York City-based landscape architecture, urban design, and public art practice. Her presentation is titled Finding Frederick Law Olmsted in Cotton's Kingdom, Slavery, Abolition, and the Founding of a Profession. Please welcome Sara Zewde.
Good afternoon. In 1852, the New York Daily Times commissioned a 30-year-old Frederick Law Olmsted to conduct an immersive research journey through the southern slave states. For 14 months, he would go on to write contemporaneously on the economic, political, and environmental conditions of the slave South, writing that would become vital to global abolition movements. His extensive documentation of antebellum America makes him the most cited witness of 19th century slavery, and his writings an invaluable historical document that significantly shapes history's view of this era. My recent research looks at how those 14 months of documenting slavery's corrosive impacts on society inspired in him the radical idea that parks and landscape could redress America's ills. For Olmsted, this was exemplified in the northern urban centers that raised him, where free labor, public investment in a constellation of institutions and infrastructures, and a commitment to parks and public spaces and landscape were critically intertwined. This journey through the so-called Cotton Kingdom, which he holds up as a social, cultural, and architectural foil to the North, becomes a centerpiece of his inspiration, methods, and legacy as a landscape architect and to the landscapes across America that he shaped. In 1854, in the later part of Olmsted's journey through the seaboard slave states, Olmsted made his way through coastal Louisiana, passing over the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. At the time of Olmsted's visit, this man, a man named John Slidell, had just been elected to the U.S. Senate representing Louisiana. And he was sent by his electorate to cast his vote with other pro-slavery congressmen to repeal the Missouri Compromise, acquire Cuba, and admit Kansas as a slave state. Following secession, John Slidell would go on to serve as the Confederacy's ambassador to France under Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In 1888, a town was formed there on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain where Olmsted had passed, and it would be named Slidell, Louisiana, in honor of the staunch advocate of slavery, John Slidell. I am flooded with pleasant memories when I reflect on my childhood growing up in Slidell, Louisiana. And the many hours and days spent at John Slidell Park are undoubtedly a predominant influence in my personal journey to finding a profession in landscape architecture. For me, the story of Olmsted in the South starts here. In part because it gives me a chance to make the distinction between myself and actual scholars. I am not a historian, I'm not a scholar, I'm a practitioner, I'm a landscape architect, and I'm also a Black woman who was born and raised in the South. So becoming a practicing landscape architect, I had this growing curiosity about the relationship between Olmsted's journeys south and his practice of landscape architecture. While the story of Olmsted's influence on America has been told time and again, the story of America's influence on Olmsted is worth telling. I believe that many of his professional activities following these 14 months became a journey towards fulfilling the potential of a free society, a mission in which landscape architecture, in his view, would play a critical part. This was an important quote for me from the papers of Frederick Law Olmsted, a quote of Charles Beveridge. He says, although Olmsted changed in 5 years from a farmer to a writer and publisher, and then to park designer and administrator, the single problem of slavery dominated his thinking and gave unity to his various activities. In 2018, I quit my job as a landscape architect, picked it up again since then, but at the time I was working at Gustus and Guthrie Nickel, and I quit my job in order to retrace Olmsted's steps across Cotton Kingdom. I pieced together some research grants from the Graham Foundation and from Dumbarton Oaks in order to sustain me, a rental car, and a litany of Airbnb and hotel reservations, and a cross-country tour of regrettable fast food choices across the South. Before hitting the road, however, I wanted to first investigate what led up to Olmsted's trip south. How had slavery shaped his early life? What were his views on slavery before his journeys, and in what ways did his views change as a result? I decided my journey then would begin with this stay in Washington, D.C. as a research fellow at Dumbarton Oaks. And that's where I would spend 4 months going through Olmsted's papers and archives, searching for some of the answers to these questions. I was shocked to come to get to know young Olmsted. Born in 1822, Olmsted came of age in the midst of the country's feverish cotton boom. Wide-eyed and curious about his tumultuous, rapidly changing world, Olmsted grappled throughout his youth and young adulthood with the central question facing the society: slavery. In correspondence with friends and family, he frequently debated the issue, and these interests would eventually prompt him to travel around the world in his 20s and develop the expository writing style he would later employ in his writing on the South. Finally, from 1852 to 1854, Olmsted made his 2 trips south, writing contemporaneously about his travels as a correspondent for the New York Daily Times, which we now know to be the New York Times, over the course of 14 months. While Frederick Law Olmsted understood his visits to the South to be his first encounters with the Cotton Kingdom, like fish unable to see water, Olmsted didn't recognize his own life to be encased in the kingdom itself. The triangular Atlantic slave trade that took place from the late 16th century to the early 19th century was the central centrifugal force in the formation of the Connecticut River Valley's economy of New England, within which the Olmsteds played a vital role since their settling in the region in 1632. The Olmsteds moved to Connecticut in 1636, looking specifically to hook the region quickly and early into the slipstream of the triangular trade. All 7 generations of Olmsteds that preceded Frederick Law would do just that, taking advantage of this system from almost every angle possible, as merchants, traders, farmers, seamen, and ship owners. The selling of dry and manufactured goods was an important agent of this global trade, and it burgeoned a merchant class in Connecticut, of which the Olmsteds were an early part. Merchant families like the Olmsteds formed the necessary link between slavery and industry that facilitated the rapid expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Hard-pressed to establish sustainable ways of life in a barely fertile region, these families would collect produce from rural farmers in the Connecticut River Valley, ship to the Caribbean islands to sell to plantation owners, and return home with sugar, molasses, and rum produced by enslaved people. Olmsted was very close with his granduncle, Gideon Olmsted, as he enjoyed hearing his harrowing tales as a sea captain traveling to the West Indies. There, enslaved Africans were forcibly growing, harvesting, and processing sugar, and Gideon would return with cargo of largely molasses for the marketplace in Connecticut. Gideon was very influential on young Olmsted, gifting him a cane that he would keep in possession until his own death. The comforts, privileges, and wealth generated by the slave trade buoyed the life of Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted's own father, John Olmsted, was a successful merchant with a store carrying a wide variety of dry goods produced by this global trade system, among them cotton. During the period of Olmsted's youth, no less than 70% of the cotton produced in the South was sold to the North. John Olmsted's surplus wealth financed a comfortable life for Frederick Law, including a high-quality private education, multiple forays and ventures into farming and publishing, and frequent family vacations. Upon his death, John Olmsted was able to bequeath Frederick and his siblings an estate of about $3 million in today's dollars. This merchant class, of which the Olmsteds were a part, were the mediating bridge between the slave plantations of the South, West Indies, and South America, and the industrial capitalism of New England and Europe. While one half of this mediation became the focus of moral condemnation among abolitionists, including Frederick Law Olmsted, the two worlds were in truth fueling each other. And so it was on the very precipice of this 40-year cotton boom from 1820 to 1860 that one Frederick Law Olmsted is born to Charlotte and John of Hartford. His formative years would unfold with the backdrop of some of the country's most significant historical moments. Young Olmsted, like the cotton plant itself, would grow expansively in these 40 years, leading to the Civil War and the construction of Central Park. I have found myself returning frequently to reread Olmsted's February 13, 1854 column in the New York Daily Times, and what would be the last in the contemporaneous series. Olmsted delivers sweeping reflections, synthesizing his major takeaways from over 14 months of travel over these 2 years. His principal conclusion was that while the effects of slavery on the enslaved were in a sense undeniable, its effects on civic society broadly extended well beyond the plantation and was more pernicious to the project of American democracy than commonly understood. Namely, he cites slavery's traces of influence on civic society as having 3 dimensions: moral, intellectual, and material. His words demonstrate an unwavering belief that landscape architecture could be a countervailing force against the ills of a slave society. Olmsted believed that landscape could be powerful, transformative space that provided both symbolic value as testing grounds for democracy and practical value to everyday life. Civic engagement in a democracy necessarily requires a negotiation of moral principles. Yet the public morals of the slave society, Olmsted observed, lacked a, quote, fundamental sense of right. The society had grown accustomed to violence, cruelty, vile treatment, and sexual assault. And they had become common occurrences in plantation life, which Olmsted himself witnessed. Olmsted believed that the lack of regard whites held for the lives of the enslaved extended to a lack of regard for their own lives, distorting the citizenry's navigation of morality in the practice of society. For Olmsted, the very idea of civic discourse and debate central to democracy had been warped by the overwhelming prevalence of human relations defined by ownership. Olmsted observed that most of the contact whites in the South had with other humans were those that they owned or subjugated, and as a result, whites had a diminished ability to engage with ideas and opinions that challenged their own. Moreover, the white elite in the South were inclined to keep the masses, whites and blacks alike, uneducated and, quote, had no thought that government should promote the education and improvement of the lower classes, end quote. The elite themselves clung to their own ignorance, desperate to remain unaware of society's ills and accept the institutions, manners, and customs as necessities imposed by providence to ensure their position at the top. Believing in their inherent superiority encouraged whites to indulge in impulses as opposed to intellectual pursuit. And Olmsted pointed to the dearth of technological innovation or great intellectual and cultural institutions in the South as evidence. To Olmsted, this repression of public education and intellect was an inherent outcome of a slave society and perilous to American democracy, which necessitates an educated public. A central function of a democratic body politic is to make collective decisions on the distribution and management of resources. Olmsted found that the practice of slavery unleashed inefficiencies in the economy and in the environment, fundamentally misguiding society's management of resources. This arduous process of forcing labor lowered the skill and speed of all laborers, free and enslaved, black and white, making the cost of labor in a slave economy significantly higher, resulting in an unaccounted inefficiency in the slave economy. Olmsted believed the undervaluing of labor itself became a hallmark of the society, rooted in the slave plantation and tempering the industrial and enterprising spirit of all laborers. Slavery drove down the wages and the working conditions of paid laborers in the South, and landless Southern whites became, quote, unambitious, indolent, degraded, and illiterate, a dead peasantry so far as they affect the industrial position of the South, end quote. Moreover, the lack of prudence in a slave economy encouraged poor soil management, misuse of fertile lands, an eradication of biodiversity for the monoculture of cotton, poor flood management practices, intensifying erosion, and beyond. Despite Olmsted's tedious documentation substantiating these claims over the course of his travels, he found that whites were so intoxicated by the practice of owning humans, or at a minimum, the idea of inherent superiority, that the ruinous effects of slavery on the economy and the environment could not be recognized as fact, and instead would continue to corrupt the ability for the citizenry to collectively manage their material resources. Olmsted believed the key to saving the democracy from this fatal influence would be to elevate our ability to form a social life together. Quote, "The only conclusion is perhaps this, that there need to be places and times for reunions," end quote. He notes specifically the role that public parks can play, noting that they have an inherent ability to, quote, "lessen that excessive materialism of purpose in which we are, as a people, so cursedly absorbed that even the natural capacity for domestic happiness, and more obviously for the employment of simple and sensible social life in our community, seems likely to be entirely destroyed," end quote. In Olmsted's view, the value of the park's beauty was in its ability to support the political aim of strengthening the body politic and attracting a wide transect of people. These parks, quote, "shall be so attractive to the nature of all that the rich and the poor shall be attracted together," end quote. Confidence in the common man, and thus the functioning of a democratic society, would be strengthened through the everyday interactions of people in public space. These convictions on the relationship between public space and the evolution of American society up from slavery, enumerated at the end of his journeys, propel his work as the founder of the profession of landscape architecture, and in effect, I would argue, represent the original ambition of the field. So in my study as an undergraduate in urban sociology, as a graduate student in Master of City Planning, and then as a graduate student in landscape architecture, that's 9 years of higher education, studying cities and landscapes, I was taught the story of Olmsted in many ways, and rarely was this dimension of his biography it actually was not discussed at all. I happened to hear in passing that he, traveled the South prior to becoming a landscape architect, and, dug into it myself. And the way that, his biography is historicized, or was historicized to me, and how I often hear it, is that he was a journalist, and he had all these, he was a wanderer and explored all these professions before he became a landscape architect. And it turns out, if we look at the chronology of his work around the South and journalism and advocacy around issues of slavery and abolition, they don't represent two different time periods, and I argue that they're actually part of the same project. So these are some key points in his life that that we can point to as it relates to the publication of his writings. And here is a graphic of some of the key points in his practice of landscape architecture. If we look at them together, we can see that he's actually going back and forth between practicing landscape architecture and rewriting his reflections on the South. He writes contemporaneously in the New York Times. He then publishes 3 volumes of his writings, and then the third publication is the 1861 singular volume, The Cotton Kingdom, which he sought to publish in a singular volume with a more staunchly abolitionist voice prior to the first shots fired of the Civil War. So he actually steps down from his position at Central Park to rewrite this. And, he has his very fiery resignation letter expressing his frustrations with the Central Park Commission, but in his personal letters, he's also describing his desire to get back to rewriting his reflections, expressing, and he writes this in the Cotton Kingdom publication, that his previous voice that he used was too apologetic, and he was ready for war. He came to the conclusion after 10 years of reflecting on this that there was no debating this with white slave owners, that this was a matter of war, and war was the only way to bring the country into union. And so here are a few of the historical moments that he's referencing as in his personal letters and in his writing that really influence his intellectual formation and his journey towards landscape architecture. Following the end of his journey south in 1854, Olmsted returns north with a clarified conviction: the need to provide uncontestable evidence of the superiority of a free and democratic society was urgent, and the North must serve as its proving ground. In a letter reflecting on one of his most frustrating encounters with a slave owner, towards the end of his journey, Olmsted writes urgently, quote, "We must go ahead and get up parks, gardens, music, schools, reunions, which will be so attractive as to force into contact the good and bad, the gentlemanly and the rowdy," end quote. Developing these institutions successfully in the North would offer a foil to the slave-holding South, where such privileges were restricted to the few. Olmsted's dedication to the design of Central Park would be founded on this conviction. The fury of work in the competition months of January, February, and March of 1858 was propelled by these convictions. Together with Calvert Vaux, for these 3 intensive months, Olmsted would keep his day job as superintendent of the commission and spend his evenings working with Vaux to translate his convictions gathered from the South into landscape design and landscape theory, culminating in a submission they would call the Greensward Plan. Olmsted finally in 1861 would resign from his position overseeing construction of Central Park and republish his writing into this singular volume entitled Journeys and Explorations in the Cotton Kingdom, as I mentioned, just weeks before the Civil War's first shots at Fort Sumter. I get this question a lot. So what about Seneca Village? So I thought I would supersede that and go ahead and answer that question, which is the decision to locate Central Park where it is precedes Olmsted's involvement by about a decade. And I cannot find a single reference of Olmsted referencing specifically Seneca Village. Having said that, he felt like there was not a worse 840 acres that could have been chosen on the island of Manhattan for this park. For a few reasons, among them, how swampy and rocky the site was. He thought that the East River was a better option, which was the original location. He also was very frustrated with the political corruption that led to the decision to locate it here. And he also writes extensively about what he calls, quote, fair play for the Negro, and that the fair play for the Negro was the ultimate measure of the success of the democracy of America. And so the dispossession of land here is a central part of the story, and I don't mean to diminish that, but Olmsted Sr. and his involvement in it, we can't to date point to any intimate involvement that Olmsted Sr. had with the removal of Seneca Village. So as I mentioned, this is actually a map that in that third publication in the Cotton Kingdom singular volume, he works with a man named Daniel Goodloe, who's an abolitionist from North Carolina. And so they mapped out, using census data, the correlation between the concentration of enslaved people and the economic wealth of the region. Basically, a big part of what he's arguing here is against he's trying to challenge the economic argument for slavery. So in places in the country where there are larger concentrations of enslaved people, the economic wealth or health of the region is poorer. That's not to say there aren't millionaires. There are certainly a few land-owning wealthy people, but in terms of the economy, which is what he's describing, the distribution of resources and the evolution of the society itself, this is a part of his counteracting that argument. And so, this kind of spatial analysis is something I like to remind my students. GIS wasn't just invented in a way, that this kind of spatial analysis, if we accept that Olmsted Sr. is the father of this profession, that this kind of large-scale thinking and spatial analysis is actually foundational to the profession. This is a mapping of his 2 trips between 1852 and 1854. And as I mentioned, I retraced his steps. I actually took the journey through the seaboard slave states. So I thought I'd share some of the images and reflections from my trip. This is a site in Richmond, Virginia, where Olmsted witnessed a very moving burial of a young black child. And he describes the topography very specifically as a series of terraced landforms. And the kind of emotion that he evokes in his writing is notable, given he tries to have a more objective, unemotional, as much as possible tone. And so I tracked down where it was, and I went to the site, and I couldn't figure out where this burial ground was until I realized I was actually in it. This site with the freeway and this casino billboard and the abandoned automobile shop is the site. And so that was tough to realize, and I started to get in contact with people. There are descendants of people that are interred here who have been fighting for a long time to commemorate this. It's convenient that Olmsted Senior went, because now all of a sudden people care but thousands of people rest here. And so my students, and I'll share a little bit of the student work that's gone around this, but my students have been working with a descendant group. We've gotten in touch with Charles and the Cultural Landscape Foundation. And so this is one of many sites along this trip that, for hundreds of years, people have been fighting to commemorate this site. And surfacing Olmsted seniors visits becomes a really useful device for advocacy. Right now, the Virginia DOT has plans to expand the freeway, and at a minimum, the first step is to fight that, and beyond that, to commemorate this in a meaningful way. One of the sites that Olmsted visited, which was a plantation, is now a prison, state prison. This is another burial ground that Olmsted visited. This one is in Savannah, Georgia. He spends quite a bit of time there, and he describes with great detail the materiality of the site. He transcribes word for word what's on some of the headstones. And so I spent quite a bit of time here. As you can tell, it's not a burial ground, and there are people buried beneath the surface of the earth, but it's a park, and it's called Whitefield Square. And so, talking to people at the square, many of them live in the neighborhood and come here daily. And when I talk to them about Olmsted, everybody's eyes light up. Of course, Olmsted, Central Park, yeah, but what does that have to do with Whitefield Square? And I have to, fortunately or unfortunately, break the news to them that Olmsted came here, and that is because he was, visiting this African burial ground. And those people still remain buried beneath here. And of course, people were pretty shocked. I didn't find a single white person who knew that. And yet they've visited this square, daily for generations in some cases. But there is a public housing development around the corner, all black residents that I spoke with there, and they all know the story. And so I tried to find where those headstones were that Olmsted transcribed, and found that they were moved when the property values started to rise in this area. They were moved to the other side of town in a low-lying area, literally on the other side of the train tracks. And I went there not really knowing what I would find, so I was there looking for I don't know what, but as the sun started to set, I got kind of freaked out at the idea of getting stuck at night in an antebellum cemetery. And so I dashed out, and as I was running out, I realized that there was this section of the ground where the sand was settling in this weird pattern. And so as I started to kind of investigate what it was, I realized there were the headstones, or at least the first one that I found that Olmsted transcribed. And using the actual words in his writing, I was able to identify that this was one of the headstones that was originally at Whitefield Square, buried beneath a layer of dirt. You know, one of the major reflections for me on this trip was the fact that a lot of the social and economic dynamics that Olmsted is documenting are still the same. They're exactly the same. But the physical landscapes that he witnesses have been recast and reshaped. And landscape architecture has been a primary tool for retelling the story of these landscapes. And so I find it an ironic twist of fate that this profession that we call Olmsted the father of has been the tool for retelling or untelling the stories that Olmsted wanted to tell about the South. And so as a practitioner for me, you know, the question becomes clear about, these tools, this profession, the skill set that it represents can be used to surface these stories. I'll share a little bit quickly with you about, I teach a seminar every fall. I'm in the middle of it now at Harvard, the world's first Department of Landscape Architecture, founded by Olmsted Jr. I pick 10 sites every year. I try to change it up a little bit. 10 of the places that Olmsted visited, and the students are paired up, and they are meant to investigate the condition. We know what the conditions were then based on Olmsted's writing. We know what the conditions are now based on me and Google. And the students are meant to investigate what's happened over the course of this 165 years and hypothesize about what the underlying factors are in that change. So I'll share just a couple of those projects. Ooh. So this is the Riversdale Plantation. It's just outside of the DMV area. At the time, it was, far away from the city, but this is the first plantation that Olmsted visits when he leaves Washington, D.C. It's in a town that's now called Riverdale, and the S was dropped in order to obscure the relationship between the plantation and the town, but we're onto them. So it was originally a 2,000-acre plantation. When Olmsted visited, it was a 2,000-acre plantation. And the Master's House is a National Historic Landmark, which you see in this image from my travels. So my students in this particular year, they found the story of the Plumbers, which is a family that was enslaved when Olmsted visited. Adam Plummer had very meticulous notes about his day-to-day life. Visiting the National Historic Landmark, there's not much about the story of the enslaved people there. And so what my students did was they made up a fake National Historic Landmark celebrating the story of the Plumbers. And because it's not for a lack of information about their lives. We have a lot of documentation about what their lives were like. And so they hacked Google Maps. If you go to Google Maps now, there's a museum. They've named it the Rose, what is it? Mount Rose Homestead. So they hacked Google Maps because what they found was the actual site of the Plumber's home on the plantation. Most of those 2,000 acres were sold. Half of it became the University of Maryland College Park, of which this plantation owner is a celebrated founder of the university. But the rest of it became the suburban development. And so the place where the Plumbers lived is now a stormwater pumping station. So the location on Google Maps, though, as I mentioned, is now the Rosemount Homestead. And they made an Instagram account for this fake site. And they worked with Justin Plummer III, who's a descendant. He's in his late 30s, and he loves the story of his family. And so if you go to Mount Rose Homestead on Instagram, you will find their final project, which is this fake online museum. And so the Plumbers have decided to take it on as part of their own family practice. So they've uploaded photos of people today, in their family, and are going to continue to keep it up. So this is the site on the right. You see them hacking Google Maps, and on the left, the kind of content that you'll find on the online presence. This is the second African burial ground, which I mentioned. My students have been working with the descendants that are interred here. This is a graphic that they made, taking the words that Olmsted used to describe the site, and they've kind of made this collage overlaying those words onto a historic image to basically help offer some context as to how and why the site feels so different than what Olmsted or than what we see there today. So you see graves advancing in irregular terraces up the hillside, a little beyond the principal cemetery, being near the foot of a hill in a crumbling bank. And they made this other collage that brings together some of the sounds and other sort of expository detail that Olmsted describes, uses to describe what he experiences there at the burial ground. And that's, as I mentioned, the site today. And one last one, this is in Colfax, Louisiana, at the Calhoun Plantation. There were somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 enslaved people at the Calhoun Plantation, and Olmsted describes witnessing the worst violence of his entire trip at this plantation. After Olmsted's trip, with that kind of ratio of enslaved people to plantation owners, following emancipation, you can imagine during the period of Reconstruction that political power, now that all of those people are immediately free and can cast a vote in theory, black political power, was in a position to really take hold. And so it's no coincidence that this place became the home of basically or the birth of Jim Crow. Historically speaking, people cite violence in Colfax, Louisiana, just after emancipation as what would proliferate into Jim Crow, and that culture of violence is very clearly documented by Olmsted on the plantation. And that violence happened basically at a voting poll just after emancipation. So my students, again, the two students, they mapped out the genealogy of the descendants from the plantation, and the violence. There was a lot of sexual violence that Olmsted witnessed, and so they mapped out the legacy of violence against black women, and one of the students is a black woman, and so she actually projected the mapping onto her own back. And filmed it, and that was their final presentation. I'll end with this. I'm sure it's not very common that Frederick Law Olmsted and Malcolm X are on the same slide, but here we go. Does anybody happen to know their connection? No. Malcolm X in his autobiography cites Frederick Law Olmsted and his writing on the South as awakening him to the conditions of enslaved people in the United States while he was in prison. So it's surprising to me that, without Frederick Law Olmsted, we may not have had Malcolm X, and in Malcolm X's own words. So, I think that the impact of Olmsted and the ambitions of the field, I think revisiting this slice of his biography and centering it into the way we tell the story of the profession offers us a lot in terms of thinking about how landscape architecture can address some of the biggest challenges that our society faces today. That was actually the ambition of Frederick Law Olmsted for this profession, and thinking about the last presentation and a lot of the challenges that landscape architects are being asked to take part in, my former boss, Catherine Gustafson, used to say that landscape architects are a shade-loving species. And I mean, it's true. I'm empowered. I feel empowered by what landscape architecture represents. I often say I became a landscape architect despite itself because I feel that the skills of shaping land are important in ways that maybe we don't even appreciate. And so that's the biggest question in my mind as I revisit this history and think about practice going forward. Thank you. Any questions?
Whether Olmsted actually had real influence on Southern gardens. Did Southerners ever pay attention to what he was saying?
You mean while he was traveling?
Or afterwards? I mean, we know Biltmore, but
Yeah.
I don't mean that.
Yeah, and so his work in his later years, I'm less qualified to speak about. I'm really focused on those early years. But it's interesting. He did have trouble connecting with Southerners while he was there. He admits to trying to adopt accents while he was there. I'm curious to see. I wish I could have heard that. But he really tried hard. He had trouble accessing plantations and accessing and gaining the trust of people originally. He was able to tap into some of his networks via Yale, people that he met at Yale, and friends that he made owned plantations, and so that helped. But for the most part, he uses a lot of code names for the plantation owners in his writing to protect their identity and protect his own relationships. It was trouble for him. It took him a while to figure out how to navigate the South culturally and socially.
Sarah, it was great seeing the extended version of your talk. We were together last week in Boston, and both times you've given this address, you've confessed at the beginning that you're not a historian, and then you take us on this journey where it's quite contradictory to the message you're delivering. As someone who's now gone back into the discipline of landscape architecture, and we've seen projects that the firm has been awarded in print, how do you look at a mentorship role for the younger people in your office who are embarking on this project work to not be historians like you?
I play a historian on TV, I suppose, and in the sense that I think it's important to engage history, and that's what I love about landscape architecture and what Olmsted offers as a methodological proposition, which is we should be reading and understanding the sites that we're designing in larger contexts, right? So it's not just about here are the site boundaries and we work within them, but there's a toggling between scales of understanding ecology and the environment and economy, and but then designing, grading a road. And the grading of a road is important in those larger contexts. That is, I think, an important tool to designing. I think it empowers us as designers in our office, at least, that's what I try to proffer to folks in the office, and that we really try to embody as a method in our design work. And so we speak openly about the lessons learned from this work in the office. It energizes me, it emboldens me, thinking about the ways in which Olmsted was an advocate and pushed and challenged his clients. The point was made yesterday that in residential work, you have to do what people want because they live there. But I think couching that work in larger contexts, even in our residential projects, that's something that we're able to do and say, you live in this watershed, and so we are going to approach it in this way. So it emboldens me. It certainly, we're a studio. We're not a big company, and so there's a clarified vision about how we want to work, and I think it helps us collaborate and work together. Yeah, I would remove the highway. I also am not a transportation planner, just like I'm not a historian. I actually am a transportation planner. I actually did study transportation planning. And so I'll go on a limb and say I think it's worth actually studying the highway network in Richmond, and I think that's a segment of the freeway that could be removed. And then a commemorative, some sort of landscape that commemorates and honors the people interred there. For me, design, and this is something that I think we can build on what Olmsted Sr. offered, which is, he describes landscapes as spaces, basically, facilities to strengthen our democracy. I also feel like embedding democracy in the process of design is part of what practice can be today. So, when clients ask me like, so what should it look like? What do you want to see here? That's not how I work or how my office works. That there's a process of engaging people and understanding, what kinds of narratives resonate in that particular place. That there's no sort of normative approach to what I think good design is, but there are idiosyncrasies of a place that are important to understand in order to design something that resonates.
Hi, Sarah. I have a question. So I'm interested in your own personal feelings or relationship to visiting these obscure burial grounds that for the enslaved people that aren't recognized, and that emotion, because I grew up in the South of North Carolina, and so anytime any school trips to plantations, it's a very interesting feeling, even though I don't have any connection familial wise. It does feel like I'm adopting a grief, a collective grief. And so I'm wondering how you feel, and your class, as well as you take on to teach the seminar in the fall.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's such extreme dissonance, going to some of the plantation tours, and even that historic landmark at Riversdale, and being asked to just admire the china, is very, but that is also just the hallmark of being Black in America. Just every day is pretty, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that's part of the experience. So, I don't know, I would say it's not a discrete trauma, but it's just embedded in a view of life, I guess. And so in that way, it becomes an everyday thing, and I understand it to be that. There are particular moments that are, acutely difficult. There were two moments where I actually broke down crying on the trip. One was in driving between Selma and Montgomery, and thinking about the civil rights movement and how much people fought for that, and then going there and really taking stock of just how much nothing has changed despite all of that. And the other one being on Fashion Plantation, which is a sugar plantation in Louisiana that Olmsted visited. And he has a conversation with an enslaved person, and he asks the enslaved person, what do you all talk about what freedom is like? And he was like, that's literally all we talk about. And he's like, okay, so what does freedom mean to you? And he was like, honestly, I just want a garden and a wife, and that's all I want. And that was a very, you can tell, as I mentioned, Olmsted tries to write in this very unattached voice, but that moment was a particular moment for him. You could tell he was struggling in that moment, and being in the place and rereading the passage again was another moment where, I'm a pessimist in general. I'm like, and so doing this journey and just reinforced all my pessimism, because, Olmsted is so hopeful about the future and what can be done to evolve the society. That's his focus. And then I just think about what he's writing and what I'm seeing and how they're the exact same. And, all we can all do is do what we can in our short lifetime, and hope, they figure it out after us, I guess.
it's really interesting to hear these very moving testimonies of Olmsted, and you're talking about as an African American, and like sort of these kind of questions: what do we want? What do I want? And Olmsted, in those moments, did what we do every day. He looked at the culture from the other side. He was willing to put himself. Why was he at these sites? Why was he at the cemetery and all that? Maybe in the profession, looking at it, why did practitioners want to be Olmsted? Put themselves in the difficult spot because they have a side to see that maybe I don't ever see, and bring that to the stage. So I congratulate you for sort of bringing those histories forward and showing that there was somebody that wasn't Black who thought about their conditions and wanted to change it as a professional.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's one of the most remarkable things that comes from this is how observant he is. And he's writing, in one paragraph, he's writing about, the relationship between the enslaved and the enslavers, the topography, the soil, the light conditions, the vegetation. I mean, all of it comes together for him, and the level of detail and the way in which he's going back and forth between these different scales of observation is incredible. And as I mentioned, this is not important just as a historical document, as a witness of these things, but for the profession itself. How do we see? How do we understand? I think there's a lot to learn from going back to this text. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We are going to take a short 15-minute break while we set up for our panel. We are going to set up a sign-up sheet after 3 p.m. today for those interested in continuing education credits. We'll just get your name, your email, and your license number, and we'll send out some information about that. So we will resume in 15 minutes.